acceptable. And so he appoints these over-the-top ideologues in secondary positions, and then they act as acting directors of these agencies instead, and he just doesn't bother to nominate anyone for the position. And anyway. Unethical? Yes. Illegal? Apparently so. Doing it anyway? Yeah, okay. Back to the story. The Government Accountability Office on Friday determined that Chad Wolf, acting Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and Ken Cuccinelli, a senior official performing Deputy Secretary duties, aren't legally qualified to hold those posts. United We Dream, an advocacy group pushing for immigration reform, said that the GAO's conclusion calls into question the latest guidance from the DHS on the Obama-era Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, that was initiated in 2012. The program has provided a legal shield to hundreds of thousands of immigrants who were brought into the U.S. as
out
children.
of sight of the media,
It's open to
and most
undocumented
people
immigrants who came to the country
are
before
not
they were
connected
16
to
and who were
those
30 or younger as
in
of
these
June
kinds of
2012.
circumstances.
The program
And
gave
so
them a
it's not one of those things that you hear
two-year work
about.
permit and a
We
reprieve
are
from
going to share this
deportation.
with you now.
Since its inception,
Anyway, it
DACA has
reads as
protected more
follows.
than
The
130,000
coronavirus
Texans
pandemic
from
pushed
deportation,
Maria and her
the second
family
highest
from a
total of
small
any state
two-bedroom
after
apartment.
California. As of December 2019, there were about 107,000 Texans with DACA permits, according to federal statistics. Wolf, who was appointed late last year, said last month he was instructing staff to, quote, take all appropriate actions to reject all pending and future initial requests for DACA, and to exercise its authority to terminate or deny deferred action at any time when immigration officials determine termination or denial of deferred action is appropriate. The GAO's determination Friday should render that order invalid, said Grisa Martinez Rosas, Executive Director of United We Dream. What's clear today from the Government Accountability Office is that Chad Wolf did not have the authority to issue this memo in the first place, she said in a statement. The GAO report says that Wolf and Cuccinelli were appointed as a result of reference to an invalid order of succession, because when former DHS Chief Kirsten Nielsen resigned in April of 2019, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency was supposed to succeed her. But instead, former Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Ken McAleenan was named as a replacement. As such, the subsequent appointments of Undersecretary for Strategy, Policy, and Plans, Chad Wolf, and Principal Deputy Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, were also improper because they relied on an amended designation made by Mr. McAleenan, the report notes. Trump announced in 2017 he was ending the DACA program, but the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in June that it was improperly terminated and allowed the initiative to continue. A federal district judge subsequently ordered that new applications should be processed at the same time the DHS was accepting other DACA renewals. After that order, Wolf instructed staff to reject certain DACA requests. The GAO's report has no legal authority, but the report authors said the findings are being referred to the DHS's Inspector General. The issue is likely to be raised more often in an election year when immigration reform advocates continue clamoring for a legislative solution for DACA recipients. U.S. Representative Joaquin Castro from San Antonio said in a statement that the GAO conclusion also calls into question recent DHS actions during nationwide protests against police practices. The Trump administration went around Congress to make invalid appointments of anti-immigrant white nationalists in violation of the law, said Castro, the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. From dismantling the immigration system to tear-gassing peaceful protesters, their authority is illegitimate. In light of this GAO decision, both Wolf and Cuccinelli must resign in disgrace or be removed from their positions immediately. Sorry, squeaky chair again. It pretty much speaks for itself. This is typical Trump behavior, and It is unacceptable, and as long as Republicans are just twiddling their thumbs in the Senate and not holding Trump accountable, it's going to continue because there's nobody stopping it. So, yeah, what more can be said? All right, moving onwards. Next article is entitled, "A Private Security Company is Detaining Migrant Children at Hotels." Under emergency coronavirus orders, the Trump administration is using hotels across the country to hold migrant children and families before expelling them. The Trump administration has been using major hotel chains to detain children and families taken into custody at the border, creating a largely unregulated shadow system of detention and swift expulsions without the safeguards that are intended to protect the most vulnerable migrants. And again, one after the other after the other. Let me repeat this part. Creating a largely unregulated shadow system of detention and swift expulsions. Typical Trump behavior. If you can't do it legally and you want to do it, figure out another way. Figure out some way that nobody's thought of before to do what you want to do that bypasses all of the safeguards and all of the checks and balances that exist, so you can just do what you want, because laws are for other people. They're not for us. Sorry, getting angry here. Government data obtained by the New York Times, along with court documents, show that hotel detentions overseen by a private security company have ballooned in recent months under an aggressive border closure policy related to the coronavirus pandemic. More than 100,000 migrants, including children and families, have been summarily expelled from the country under the measure. But rather than deterring additional migration, the policy appears to have caused border crossings to surge, in part because it eliminates some of the legal consequences for repeat attempts at illegal crossings. The increase in hotel detentions is likely to intensify scrutiny of the policy, which legal advocacy groups have already challenged in court, saying it places children in an opaque system with few protections and violates U.S. asylum laws by returning them to life-threatening situations in their home countries. Children as young as a year old, often arriving at the border with no parents, are being put in hotels under the supervision of transportation workers who are not licensed to provide child care. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials say the children are being adequately cared for during the hotel stays and emphasize that their swift expulsion is necessary to protect the country from the spread of the coronavirus. Federal authorities have resorted to using hotels during previous spikes in immigration and as staging areas for short periods of time ahead of traditional deportations. The conditions are in many ways better than the cold, concrete Border Patrol holding cells. Housing. I was trying to say housing and reading holding. The concrete Border Patrol holding cells where many migrants have been left to languish in the past. But because the hotels exist outside the formal detention system, they are not subject to policies designed to prevent abuse in federal custody of those requiring that detainees be provided access to phones, healthy food, and medical and mental health care. Parents and lawyers have no way of finding the children or monitoring their well-being while they are in custody. The existence of the hotel detentions came to light last month, but documents reviewed by the New York Times reveal the extent to which major chains are participating. The Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has detained at least 860 migrants at Equality Suites in San Diego, Hampton Inns in Phoenix, and in McAllen and El Paso, Texas, a Comfort Suites Hotel in Miami, a Best Western in Los Angeles, and an Econo Lodge in Seattle. Remember those names, everyone, if you would like to complain. Quality Suites, Hampton Inns, Comfort Suites, Best Western, and Econo Lodge. And here's another article about the same thing. Though the data does not specify ages, the officials who provided it as well as several former immigration officials who recently left the Trump administration, said it was likely that most or all were either children traveling alone or with their parents, because single adult migrants tend to be housed in Border Patrol holding stations. The administration's pandemic-related border closure policy calls for migrants to be expelled from the country rather than put into traditional formal deportation proceedings. Parents often send their children to the American border alone because they are more likely to win asylum if they are not traveling with adults. Under the new policy, most children are instead put on planes and returned to their home countries, primarily in Central America, though some have been handed over to child welfare authorities in Mexico, leading parents into desperate efforts to track their children down. Searching for the children has been made nearly impossible because they are not being assigned identification numbers that would normally allow families to track their locations in the highly regulated federal detention system. Only rarely used in the past, the practice of expulsions has surged under the Trump administration's coronavirus-related border ban. Unlike deportations, expulsions are meant to take place very soon after a migrant is encountered by immigration agents, but delays in securing flights necessary to return the increasing number of migrants now arriving at the border have led the administration to turn the MVM Incorporated, a private corporation known mostly as a transportation and security company, to detain migrant children and families. Yeah, I'm sure they're qualified. Started in the late 1970s by 3 former Secret Service agents, MVM has grown substantially. The company now has contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars in nearly all of the federal agencies involved in immigration enforcement. It has secured at least $1.9 billion in federal contracts since 2008. The reputation was, "You ask it, they do it," said Claire McNulty, a former Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Detention Planning and Policy at ICE. No task was too big for MVM. Before the pandemic hit, MVM was the primary company used to transport migrant families encountered at the border to family detention centers. Its security workers oversee the tent courts that were erected to process cases of asylum seekers who have been made to wait out their cases in Mexico. In 2018, when a federal judge ordered the reunification of families that had been separated by immigration authorities along the border, MVM transported parents to staging facilities near the shelters where their children were being detained. Despite its substantial transportation portfolio, MVM does not have much experience detaining migrant children. In a previous foray in 2018, the company was criticized for detaining children overnight in a vacant office park in Phoenix. 2 laws weigh heavily on the treatment of detained migrant children. The Prison Rape Elimination Act requires procedures to allow them to independently report physical or sexual abuse by government workers or contractors. To comply with the law, migrant detention centers post phone numbers to abuse hotlines and provide detainees with free access to phones. Public data show that 105 such reports were made against government immigration contractors in 2018, the most recent year of available data. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act provides safeguards to ensure that detained children who could be abused or tortured in their home countries are not sent back into harm's way. Neither of these protections appear to apply to the informal hotel stay overseen by MVM. A transportation vendor should not be in charge of changing the diaper of a 1-year-old, giving bottles to babies, or dealing with the traumatic effects they might be dealing with, said Andrew Lorenzen-Straight, another former Deputy Assistant Director for Custody Management at Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, who worked with MVM during his time at the agency. "I'm worried kids may be exposed to abuse, neglect, including sexual abuse, and we will have no idea," he said. A spokesman for MVM said the company's contract with ICE bars representatives from responding to media requests. Draw your own conclusions there. ICE officials provided a statement explaining that MVM workers are trained in the requirements of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, but the company is not contractually required to follow its rules. Which means what? Hey, they know about it, but they don't have to do anything about it. Oh my God. This is who we have making decisions. This is who we have doing things. This is who is leading the country. This is who represents you and me. These people. Sorry. The statement said company employees are instructed extensively on how to handle situations where detained migrants would be left particularly vulnerable in their presence, such as when the migrants are bathing or breastfeeding. It says red flags indicating potential torture or abuse could be reported to the guards, who would then share the information with ICE, but there appear to be no mechanisms for detainees to report abuse by guards except to other guards. An ICE spokesman said no more than 2 children could be housed in a hotel room at any given time, but at least one migrant teenager said he was detained overnight in a hotel room in Miami with 2 other younger migrants and 3 guards. 3 migrants and 3 guards in a single hotel room. Okay. Expulsions have come to replace formal deportation proceedings as the primary way of processing migrants who try to enter the United States during the pandemic. About 109,621 people have been expelled from the southwest border since the restrictive policy went into effect. Announced as a policy to prevent the coronavirus from spreading further in the United States. And we know that we've done a great job of keeping our numbers down here. The border directive adopted in March, which relies on the authority available to the Surgeon General during public health emergencies, was intended to block the flow of most non-essential travel across the northern and southern borders. Seeking asylum from violence or persecution is not considered essential under the policy. But even with the restrictions in place, millions of people continue to cross the border each month, calling into question whether the expulsion policy can truly mitigate the spread of the virus. And the Trump administration has been testing migrant children to confirm that they have not contracted the coronavirus before expelling them, as was first reported by ProPublica. If the children have been confirmed to be virus-free, they are then being expelled. Some children who test positive have remained in the hotels to quarantine, while others have been placed in government shelters for migrant children, as was the practice before the pandemic. Unlike children, many adults have been deported and expelled despite having tested positive for the virus. While the practice of detaining migrant children and families in hotels has been previously reported, the fact that so many well-known hotels are part of the program only became apparent with the release of the list. Some of the hotels listed appear to be unaware of the program. After facing scrutiny for detaining dozens of migrant children and parents in its hotels in McAllen, Phoenix, and El Paso, Hilton, whose participation was previously reported by the Associated Press, said the decision to do so had been made by franchisees. The corporation released a statement saying that it was against company policy for its hotels to be used for detention and that all franchise locations had been notified they should reject future requests for reservations for that purpose. A legal challenge on behalf of the children detained at the hotel in McAllen was settled earlier this month when the government agreed to release them. One unaccompanied child and the few families that remained were transported to a family detention center in Karnes City, Texas. A spokeswoman for the Choice Hotel chain, which has been used to detain migrants in Miami, Seattle, and San Diego, said in response to the data obtained by the Times, "It has been our position that hotels should not be used as detention facilities, and we were not aware that any hotels in our franchise system are being used in this capacity. We ask that our franchised hotels, which are independently owned and operated, only be used for their intended purpose." Mike Karacher, a spokesman for the Hampton Inn in Phoenix, one hotel franchise that had been used by MBM, said management was not aware of the activity and does not support or wish to be associated with it. The hotel has confirmed that they will not accept similar business moving forward, he said. The American Hotel and Lodging Association, an industry trade group, said it opposed the use of hotels as detention centers and has sent out guidance to its members on red flags that could indicate rooms being used for this purpose. Well, okay, that's something. I'm glad they were looking into that. The expulsion policy is part of a sweeping crackdown by the administration on both legal and illegal immigration that appears to have intensified in recent months. Confidential documents submitted by a court-appointed monitor in a long-running federal case warned that the use of hotels for detaining children had become prevalent. Begun as a relatively small stopgap measure to assist in the transfer of children to ICE flights, the temporary housing program has been transformed by the Title 42 expulsion policies into an integral component of the immigration detention system. Excuse me. My throat is getting dry. There have been several legal attempts to challenge the expulsions, especially of children, including one case in which a judge recently appointed by President Trump sided against government lawyers. But the government avoided an injunction blocking the policy in each case by agreeing to release the individual children named as plaintiffs, rendering the challenges moot. Once again, just kind of going around, just like, I'll stop that and just do it over here. I'll stop it here where you're complaining and start doing it here where you haven't complained yet. And I just keep going and I just keep going. Immigrant advocates say the government has also agreed to release individual children who have been discovered in the expulsion system, but there are many others whose locations are unknown. Lee Gilland, who is leading the legal challenge against the policy for the ACLU, said the primary problem is that children are not being offered a way to obtain asylum from unsafe conditions in their home countries, as is required by law. As dangerous as it is for children to be secretly held in hotels, he said, the ultimate problem is that they are expelled without a hearing, regardless of where they are held. So, I don't even know what to say about that. I mean, I've talked about this at length, and even in this show, about how the current administration just goes around, goes over, goes under, or just bowls right through any restrictions that it doesn't like for what it wants to do. And if nothing else, even if you agree with what they're doing, you can't agree with the way they go about doing it. There cannot be an unaccountable government. I don't know exactly, unaccountable leaders in this country who do what they want to do regardless. You may not think that all our restrictions are fair, or maybe there's too many hoops to jump through, and so on, but they're there for a reason. They exist in order to make our leaders accountable to us and to be held to a standard of behavior. And this administration is not being held to a standard of behavior. They do what they want. And it's just, I'm trying to avoid advocating for or against any political party here, but it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable at all. Not just with immigration, but with anything that they're doing, with everything that they're doing. It's just, we can't run a country this way. No matter who's in charge, no matter what they're trying to do, you cannot operate like this for long without things just coming apart. Simple as that. Okay, I'm going to try to get one more thing in here quickly if I can. This is an article entitled "Wealthy Turn Anti-Immigrant when their riches are threatened. What a surprise. A psychological study has found anti-immigration sentiment rises when affluent people fear losing their wealth. The University of Queensland's Professor Jolanda Jetton said harsh attitudes towards immigrants were found in times of economic downturn and relative deprivation, and also in prosperous times. Affluent people who fear losing wealth in the short or long term experience collective angst about their group's future vitality and wealth status, she said. Our research found this fuels negative attitudes towards immigrants and minorities. Even though wealthy people may have a lot, their fear of falling is associated with opposition to immigration. Professor Jetton said the research turned accepted wisdom on its head, showing that society's most economically vulnerable were not always the most supportive of anti-immigration calls. In explaining the rise of right-wing populism, many have pointed to the 2008 global financial crisis as the root cause of rising anti-immigrant sentiments, she said. Experts had long believed that economic downturns triggered perceptions of relative deprivation and chances of civil conflict. Moreover, economic crises, so the argument typically goes, increase fear and frustration among poor working-class voters. These dynamics are typically referenced when discussing Trump's victory in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections and the success of populist parties like One Nation in Australia. The assumption that economic crises combined with individual relative deprivation provide fertile soil for populism dominate many of the discussions on the origins of right-wing populism and anti-immigrant sentiments more generally. But the new research highlighted wealthier people who might be attracted to such populist parties, said Professor Jetton from the UQ School of Psychology. It seems that if you have a lot of money, you feel you have a lot to lose, and the fear of falling makes you feel vulnerable and concerned about the future, she said. The research team, including Dr. Frank Moles and Dr. Nick Steffens, found an association between opposition to immigration and fear of losing wealth, individually or collectively, across 4 studies involving a total of more than 1,000 people. In the laboratory, when we made people feel wealthy, they were more opposed to immigration when they were made to feel that they might lose some of their wealth in the future than the group who felt their wealth was secure, Professor Jetton said. In a study among Australian participants, we found the fear of their own financial future, or that of Australia's, will be worse than the present, was associated with more opposition to immigration. The results may help us to explain why support for political parties with anti-immigrant messages sometimes comes from the wealthiest in society. Why can't I talk? The results may help us to explain why support for political parties with anti-immigrant messages sometimes comes from the wealthiest in society. This is important at a time when populist parties and leaders with strong anti-immigrant stances are a force to be reckoned with in many countries. Okay, I have run out of time. I appreciate your joining us. I hope you will join us again next time. And until then, see you later.